Hi, my name is Carmine Starnino. I'm the associate publisher of Véhicule Press. Welcome to the launch for Antonyms for Daughter by Jenny Boychuk. The book is part of the Signal Editions poetry series, an imprint that I edit for the press. I'm coming to you live from Montreal, but I'm not the only one joining Jenny for this event. One of the things I love about these virtual launches is that we can beam in guests from almost anywhere, which allow us to do something more than just launch a book, but also celebrate the community around that poet, the literary friendships that have provided support and counsel. And in that sense, we're joined by a very fine poet, Michael Pryor. Michael is a friend of Jenny's, and he is also a former Vehicle poet. We published his debut, Model Disciple, in 2016. Along with reading from his own poems, Michael is going to help me explore some of the elements that makes Jenny's poetry and this book so outstanding. In a little bit, I'm going to invite Jenny, who will read from the book and talk to me a bit about her process. And then we will switch to Michael, who will read from his own work. Then Jenny will be back for another short reading, and then we'll move to the question and answer period. And that means that I'm going to encourage everyone to post their questions wherever you may be watching this on Facebook or YouTube. We'll keep tabs on those questions, select the best, and one of them will win a free copy of the book. But you don't have to pin your hopes on a free copy. You can buy yourself one from any number of places, including and especially our partner bookseller, Monroe's Books, a fantastic independent shop in Victoria, BC. They have lots of copies, and they will be delighted to ship you one if you order it online. So poetry's link to elegy runs deep. Elegies are mainstay of the tradition. They comprise among the greatest poems. But they've also sparked some of our most interesting book-length projects. I'm thinking here of Sharon Olds' collection, The Father, about her father's death, Douglas Dunn's volume about the loss of his first wife, Elegies, and the American poet Mary Jo Banks' book about her late son called Elegy. Jenny's book is in some way akin to those. It mourns the death of a mother. More specifically, it's a roughly chronological account of how she, in large part, succumbed to substance abuse. So you can imagine it's a book written in a very bleak key. That said, it's not confessional in the traditional self-indulgent sense. The poems are immaculately constructed. They're intricate, musical, shaped not so much by emotion, although there's lots of that, but by a sharp and serious intelligence. An antonym is a word that has the opposite meaning of another word. So bad, good, up, down. One of the ideas that Jenny explores in this book is that death creates a kind of category disruption. It upends everything we know. In her grief, the speaker in the book explores the antonyms for various ideas, heart, inheritance. But what drives the poems is a single question. When the death of a mother severs you from the category of being daughter, what do you become? What is the opposite of daughter? What is the antonym for that state? The overall effect of watching Jenny try to answer that question was, for me, and still is, overwhelming. Antonyms for Daughter is a book of moving and impressive poems, and I'm looking forward to sharing some of them with you tonight. So I'd like to invite Jenny on.
Hi. Thanks, Carmen.
Jenny, hi.
Hi.
So
oh, go ahead.
No, please, go ahead.
Oh, I just wanted to take a minute to thank everybody who's spending their Friday night here with us tonight.
My first question is sort of on the genesis of the collection. So I guess I'm curious as to what made you decide to dedicate an entire book to your mom. I mean, what was the moment you realized that what you needed was an entire collection to sort of reckon with what happened rather than a single poem?
Yeah.
Or even a suite of poems? Like when did you realize that this was the project was going to take over, was going to take on it, needed an entire book?
Yeah, so I don't think there was ever a single moment where I sat down and decided that I was going to write a book-length collection about losing my mom. The way the book actually started was when I was a MFA student at the University of Michigan. So when you do an MFA in poetry, your thesis is a book of poems, essentially. And so at that time, my mom was still alive, and she was wrestling with a number of things. And she had really actually, in my second year of my MFA, she had sort of taken a turn for the worse. And it was really kind of day by day, I would say. And every day I was just sort of, wondering if I was going to get that phone call saying that she was no longer with us. And so at that time, the book was really about being in that sort of really uncomfortable, really terrifying gray space, where you're just sort of living day by day. And it was more about the fear of losing her. And then while I was there in my fellowship year, after the fact, she did end up passing away. And so then all of a sudden I sort of moved into this place of grief, which is a whole other sort of all-consuming place to be. And I didn't write for probably about 6 months or so after that. But then I ended up coming back to my parents' house. And I had the intention to stay for the summer, and I ended up staying for a couple of years. But that was a whole other sort of level of intensity because she was still sort of here all around me all the time. And so I was just sort of writing my way through all of that. And then before you know it, you have a bunch of poems and you start putting the poems together and you realize you have a book, and it just kind of went from there.
Yeah, I mean, were you surprised at the end of it that you had written so many poems about the experience? I mean, were you writing poems alongside these poems? I guess I'm just wondering, like, how intense the whole process was, and were you sort of was there a decision to sort of keep the focus on your mom, or were you somewhat surprised by the stuff that you found yourself returning to?
No, I don't think I was surprised at all. I'm one of those people who really believes that we don't choose our subject matter. I think that we can try, like maybe, for example, we want to try an intellectual exercise in a poem, or maybe we decide we want to try something formal and we just want to challenge ourselves to write a sestina or a villanelle or something. But it just seemed, this was such a huge part of my life. And it also really had an influence on my formative years as well. So it's really hard to sort of separate myself from it. And whatever part of myself that it is that brings me to the page, this whole thing was kind of always right there. So I kind of only really know a time in my writing career where I was writing about this subject matter. And before that, it was when I was 20 and writing love poems about coffee. So
All right. Okay, so I'm going to step away and have you read a few poems for us.
okay.
Thank you.
So I'm going to start off with the first poem in the book, which is also the first poem that I ever wrote for this book, almost 10 years ago now. It's called Antonym for Lullaby. 3 nights I've dreamed you dead, once in the bath, twice in your bed, once the sting of cinnamon in the kitchen, once the waft of honey bread. Each time, white crocuses on the floor. The first night, grief, your ashes hummed fire. The second, I leaned against a window, pleaded against the pain, while in the bathroom, the pipes backed up, tongues thrust through the drains. On the third moon, I woke in the nightgown of a little girl, to cries soaked in shadow, and your ghost, mother, knotting my wrists behind my back with a bedsheet. You pressed your hand against my chest until I couldn't breathe, and then you sat at the edge of my bed and rocked all those nameless whispers to sleep. You wake, disoriented, in late afternoon's velvet light, Drawn to the kitchen sill, you slice blood oranges, reheat dark roast from this morning. A chicken carcass ages in your fridge, though the meat has long been torn, picked from its wishbone. You can't fall asleep and wake to the same day, the blue hour stirring, without horn-startled memories rushing in. The last time you heard your mother breathing, or the night your father came home from driving trains and something wasn't quite right, but he didn't say anything until you were older. Told you he hit a dark figure stalking the tracks that night. How it wasn't the first time. How beautiful the backcountry was with fresh snow in that moonlight. How it takes a mile to stop a train. Postcard, winter. On the 5th day, I walk across the ceiling, but can't reach the floor. It's Thursday. I wake with so much blood in my cheeks. Every detail of her life demanding to be pressed in gold. The box is full. Death is the beginning of an endless, fruitless harvest. I was too late. Nothing but bare branches and pails of pits and stones. Nothing but fire in the dark room. Ships cresting mountain peaks. The snow is gentle, but I can't stand the greed, the way it claims and claims. Mary insists I don't have to be good, but I know nothing walks out of the walls unless it's called. I turned my back on my mother for just 4 days, looked away. Now I sleep with the light on. In the morning, grief rinses me until the water runs clean, wrings me out, hangs me back up to observe another strange new angle of the pale sky, where my eyes find the moon like a marble my younger self might have found in the corner of a bedroom and brought to her lips and rolled around in her mouth.
That's great. I guess hearing you read, like I'm struck on about, I mean, I'm not sure if this is the word, but the sense of artistic appropriation. So the poems are unsparing. I mean, but not in any way that betrays, embarrassing autobiographical details. But were you ever concerned, nonetheless, that you were telling tales that you shouldn't be telling? Part of the book's power, it seems to me, I mean, you sense it's in those poems, but especially in some of the others in the book. But part of the book's power is how you struggle with the ethics behind what you're doing, and I'm wondering if that makes sense to you, like the way I see it, that there is a sense in the book that you feel that sometimes you feel that there are lines that you're crossing that you shouldn't cross, or you feel somewhat that it's a project that you feel a little afraid to have taken on.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of that is, when you write, it's just you and the page, and my approach has always just been to write the poems and, deal with the consequences later, to some degree. But, when I was working on this book earlier on, when I was doing my MFA, for example, I did feel like I would never publish these poems while my mom was alive. And that being said, I didn't know if she would live another year. I didn't know if she would live 20 years, but I was always very afraid of exploiting her in some way. And then I think there's another part of it as well, which is just that I always felt very protective of her. And even though all of these things happened, and, there are some darker parts of our history, I just, people are complex, and there's never just good, that's why I pursued the Antonym Project, because it's never just good or bad. It's all of it together. But now I think, after she passed away, I felt like things were different. When we think about the idea of ethics it's really about vulnerability, and it's really about making someone vulnerable to be potentially hurt in some way, whether it's emotional or physical or however it might be. And, you know, the truth of it is just that my mother has passed away and she can't be hurt anymore. And so when I take a different perspective of it and back up a little bit, I don't see any way that these poems could hurt anyone. Of course, there's my immediate family, but, you know, they know that I'm a writer, and I try to keep the dialogue open about this. And, you know, it's not always necessarily comfortable, but I just try to be as transparent as possible about it. And yeah.
Was there, I mean, did you talk to any members of your family while you were writing it? I mean,
No.
to jog them. Some people I know who work on memoirs sometimes have to reach out to
Yeah.
members of their family to you know, just to double check a memory, or to double check a detail, or even in some cases to maybe ask permission to tell a story that they feel, you know, they don't have the right to tell. I'm just curious if, you know, if your method in writing these poems involved sort of, you know, I don't know, sort of talking to people in your family who knew your mom and knew the situation you guys were in.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there's sort of another element to this, which is that I had written I had written a personal essay that basically really laid out everything that my family had sort of gone through, and it ended up winning a major award. And so that was before I had finished this book. And so that essay was so much more revealing to me than this book is, because the thing with poetry as well is that the truth in poetry is not just factual truth, but the truth comes from language, and it comes from the lyric, and sometimes it comes from syntax or rhythm. And so, you know, there are all of these things that you can do in poetry that are actually kind of protective in some ways, I think, that you can't do in nonfiction, for example. And so honestly, by the time this book came out, it was kind of old news for my family because I had already, you know, I had already been out there talking about our experiences and that sort of thing. So if that hadn't happened, it might be a little bit of a different story, but I had already kind of had the chance to do that work before this book came out.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm gonna back away and have you read some more. Thanks.
Errands and preparations. At the funeral home, a man smiles unnaturally as I sign the release, then disappears to fetch you for tomorrow's service. I carry you outside in an antique biscuit tin, nestle you carefully on the back seat of your car, and together we run errands at Walmart, the bakery, and liquor depot. It's a hot day, the kind of day you wouldn't dare leave a dog in the car. I pack frozen lasagnas, bottles of wine, bouquets of flushed peonies around you. Yes, you, thinking how lucky that on a summer day like this, you're already ash and can't burn further, can't become less. Afterlife. I had no choice but to embody the lake. My nail beds anchored beneath stones, weeds. To float or drown is the same ache. Relentless, the revolving door, asleep, awake. The paradox of an afterlife forced me deep. I had no choice but to embody the lake. Memory slithers, wicked. Its demands make birds fly jagged into the false mouths of trees. To float or drown is the same ache. My mother is buried, but it thrills her to shake a house until every jar falls out. Believe me, I had no choice but to embody the lake. A shy girl kneels at the shore, bakes a cake of sand, pebble sprinkles, a candle, a plea. To float or drown, I worry, is the same ache. Even the clearest dreams of her are opaque. Even her mirrors are draped with white sheets. I didn't have a choice. I embodied the lake. To float or drown is the same ache. Antonym for funeral. I search for you in the churchyard, a fistful of baby teeth to sacrifice. Find you in the trees as they dream of the last of their sickly yellow leaves. I sharpen my disbelief while everyone prays inside, hands pressed bone to lonely song. You stand between me and the stagnant pond. Fill my ears with summer. Watch passing clouds learn how to disappear. With dull blades, we transcribe hymns on birch bark, carve white betrayals across birthmarks. Your sharp guilt peels back my skin. Mother, can you bear it? Your husband working so hard to keep the windows dirty, to protect the crows. He wants you to know he doesn't care about the worst lie you ever told. You slipped out of your own funeral. I skipped it too, searched for you in these living woods. In the cemetery, the spirits try on your wedding dress, summon their voices from abandoned snail shells, bottomless lakes, the mouths of their daughters, and sing, imagine spring never comes. Now, imagine it actually doesn't come.
Thanks, Jenny. So I'm going to ask Michael to read for us, but I'm going to introduce him first. Michael's most recent book of poems, Burning Province, was published by McLennan Stewart last year. It won the Canada-Japan Literary Award and the Dorothy Livesey Poetry Prize. He's also the author of Model Disciple, which he published with us in 2016. That collection was named one of the best books of the year by CBC. He now lives in New York City, where for the next 8 months, he is the Cullman Center Fellow at the New York Public Library. Michael Pryor.
Thanks so much, Carmen. And thank you, Jenny, for that really beautiful reading from your very beautiful book. I was asked to read a poem that in some ways kind of was in conversation with Jenny's work. So I was struck in Jenny's reading by the quality of the light. Velvet light, I think, is one of the phrases, and also by the ash and fire. So this is a poem called My Father's Birthday is a Day Before Mine. The last train pulses across the pane, and fireflies spark beside the tracks. Acne's red wing flames my face. I can't take back this skin. In the other room, a drugstore Timex synchronizes with the faucet's drip. If I squint, the fireflies align their lives to map the summer's migraine of flowers that were weeds. You say, but I think they're just trying to survive. Cheap bulbs, they burn out in 2 weeks. The train rattles as its links shift and scrape like the dark between days. From across the continent, my father texts. Your mother hiked halfway up the hill behind the cabin, a graceful mountain goat. Is this love? Lately, I've been writing you letters that I shred about that blood orange eclipse, sleep's determined murmurs of eyelid and lash. The fireflies are sunset's ash. I realize I have no means by which to make you a present of the past, where my father once cowered behind the June sunflowers, bloodied by the dog chain his father had swung, not at his son, but at the fear of being left without one. The fireflies stutter like an apology. I would be lying to you if I didn't admit I love them. The next poem I'm going to read is the first poem in the book, and kind of inverse of what happened with Jenny. It was actually the last poem I wrote for the book. And it's called 150 Pounds. And it responds to a series of images taken by the Japanese-Canadian artist Kayla Isumura. I'm Japanese Canadian, and my grandparents were incarcerated in the camp during the Second World War in British Columbia, along with 20,000 other Japanese Canadians. And so Isumura recently went up and down the west coast of Canada and America and asked like fourth and fifth generation Japanese Canadians, people my age, younger, what they would pack if they were being sent to a camp. And then she photographed what they packed. And so this poem responds to her sequence of images, which is called the Suitcase Project. And it starts with an epigraph from the BC Security Commission, who were the group of people who helped organize incarceration. Each adult will be allowed 150 pounds, and each child will be allowed 75 pounds of baggage. In some, the luggage lies open like a mouth mid-sentence. In others, closed zippers grimace. What would you have brought? Slippers? A stuffed platypus, a gold watch on a chain, copper pots swaddled in bedding. The hypotheses that thinking can be things, that each decision shrinks a pained mind to the space inside a suitcase. Include lacquered chopsticks, silver forks, a hammer scarred by rust, the orders nailed to telephone poles and doors. Omit what you whispered then, most of what you've seen. I was given 48 hours notice, 24. I passed ice and pines and plains. I rode an iron serpent into the interior beside 400 others. It was humid. It was cold. If pain is remembered to be dismissed, if fear still seeds its rotting forest, this is a gardener's trowel, a blue skein of yarn, a violin, a ukulele, a ukulele, a ukulele. This is a porch light flicked on and off an abscess night. These are pear blossoms falling on the driveway like footprints in black ice. Memories, river stones metamorphic and worn. How many might an able-bodied individual carry through livestock stalls and mud, onto a bus, a train, into a tiny, uninsulated shack? Most say the same. It could happen again. It is happening now. I couldn't make room for a dogless collar, a houndstooth scarf, a steel urn packed in styrofoam, a letter recording blood's divisive fractions. My father would not have come. My mother, my stepsister, my brother. What matters is not what you bring, but what you keep. She was there. He was too. I'm just going to read one more poem. It's the last poem in the book. And it's the book's pretty bleak, but I think this is a kind of uplifting love poem in a way, or is a sort of love poem at least I can write. And it begins with an epigraph from Kenko, who is a medieval Japanese monk and who wrote a really wonderful series of zuitsu, which are kind of fragmented essays. And it's called Wakeful Things. You should never put the new antlers of a deer to your nose and smell them. They have little insects that crawl into the nose and devour the brain. Kenko. Consider that the insects might be metaphor, that the antler's wet velvet scent might be Proust's Madeleine dipped into a cup of tea, adorned with centrifugal patterns of azalea and willow. Those fleshing the hill behind this room, walls wreathed in smoke and iron, musk of the deer head above the mantle. He was nailed in place before I was me. Through the floorboards, a caterpillar, stripped from its chrysalis by red ants, wakes as if to a house aflame. Silk frays, like silver horns, like thoughts branching from a brain. After the MRI, my father's chosen father squinted at the wormholes raveling the screen and said, "Be good to one another. Love how inelegantly we leave, how insistent we are to return in one form or another. I wish all of this and none of it for us. More sun, more tempest, more fear and fearlessness, more of that which is tempered, carved, and worn, creased into overlapping planes. The way I feel the world's aperture enlarge in each morning's patchwork blur of light and color, while I fumble for my glasses beside the bed, lenses smudged by both our hands. When they were alive, those antlers held up the sky. Now, what do they hold? Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Michael. I am going to ask Jenny to come back and read maybe 2, 3 more poems. I'm also going to encourage people watching this to leave a question. We very much want to give away a book, and would like you to leave a question in the comment box right below where you're watching this. Thank you. All right, Jenny, take it away.
Sounds good. Also, thank you for your reading, Michael. It was beautiful. The long game. You live beyond time, clay, blood, lady slippers, aspen, empty honey jars, thorns. Everyone knows this about the dead, but no one else could open this closet or glance at that staircase and find you. A daughter searches for her dead mother and returns with sunflowers braided into her hair. This will always be true. Even the dying, they say, even the dying, out of their minds, will recognize a ghost at the end of their bed. I have forgiven so much, and still, it's only morning where I am. I know nothing yet of afternoons or evenings. I have barely shaken myself awake from the soft decades of childish dreaming. No one sees me here. I scale a steep riverbank where months ago we tossed your ashes to the wind with a coffee mug, my brother crying and me laughing, the children balance, invisible on slick stones. See? Invisible because I can't stop scanning the tall grass for the little ghost boy you once warned me about, how the undertow yanked him down by the ankles, how he wades now in and out of frigid waters in a wash of light that must look something like daybreak, thinking himself so lucky to still be playing, unseen, uncalled by his mother who knows only evenings now, all these years later. Okay, I think this is the last poem I'm going to read. It's called New Inventory. Neither antonym nor synonym after all, I put my mother away and ask my body to claim its shadow as a part of the whole. Each day I am alive in the oak forest, the evening ocean spray, the mirrors of the city, while she remains ash at the bottom of a frigid river in an evergreen town, secreted away. I have done the chores of remembrance, the filling of boxes, envelopes, and photo frames. I have recorded the milestones of death, month by month, like a mother for her baby. There is the book with a lock of my infant mother's hair pressed inside. There is the book with a lock of my own hair pressed inside. Shade for shade, curl for curl. My mother's sweater, soaked in her perfume, must be left alone, fragrant in its wooden box. And now what? The question is a cliff without a view. I say my goodbyes to the child's chair on the staircase landing, the willow angels with their arms snapped off, the paintings in their glassless frames, blood smeared and darkened on their borders. Goodbye to her voice and her fury. Goodbye to the whispers of an afternoon blizzard. And though I will never forget her hands, goodbye to them too, to the hands that poured cream into coffee and sprinkled sugar over bowls of strawberries. Goodbye to her wedding ring, though it fits perfectly. The note left in her bed was unfinished. I can't find hope, happiness, home. Oh, Mom, I promise I won't ask again what you meant. Let stem replace bone.
Oh, Jenny, what a poem. That child's chair just always gets me. I mean, it's full of details, but just that chair. And your mother sprinkling sugar over the strawberries. That's just lovely. It's funny. I mean, there is. I'm gonna have Michael ask for Michael to join us now. It's funny because there are throughout the book there aren't a lot of revealing details. Like there, in a sense that like you don't say very much about what happened. There, I mean, one can decode from various details and various anecdotes. But these are not, like I mentioned before, these are not confessional poems in the sense that you're just sort of like spilling everything. So it was interesting to hear you say about how you feel poetry can be protective in a way that like prose can't. I've never heard that before. I mean, I've never heard it put that way before. I think you're right. But yet the poem is filled with those small domestic details, like the sprinkling of sugar on strawberries. And then they come up against these sort of images of blood and dark forests, and it's just it's just an interesting way of creating mood. I guess, yeah. It just struck me when you were reading it. It just struck me that your method for generating a kind of emotional power isn't what one would expect from tradition. One had one's experience with elegies, particularly elegies from parents. Those books that I mentioned before, the Mary Jo Bang book, the Douglas Dunn book, the Sharon Olds book, or Thomas Gunn's elegies just during the AIDS era. All of them involve some sort of grim storytelling. There's storytelling in your book, and it's grim, but it's not quite as it doesn't quite have the kind of non-fiction elements that one would expect. It's funny, not funny, good. It's just it just strikes you when you read the book.
Yeah, I think I don't know. I've always felt like there's a lot of power in contrast, and
Yeah.
I think like we can understand like the severity of something by looking at putting it up against something else. So like you said, whether it's a bowl of strawberries next to a broken frame that has blood all over it. And then the other part of it too is I just, and going back to what I had said earlier about really wanting to portray her or myself or anybody as a whole person who has all of these different elements, I really wanted to show, the moments where she could be very loving and had all of these little quirks and these really sweet little funny things. And then also, the other side of things as well. So,
yeah. Michael, do you have
I actually have a question for Jenny.
Oh, good.
Well, I think this segues nicely from what we're kind of talking about, like what we show, what we don't show in the poem, the idea of restraint, the idea of the poem and its form as kind of protection. And I was thinking about the title of the book, which Carmine did like a wonderful job of kind of doing a critical exegesis of in like his opening comments, but like this idea of the antonym. And I was wondering, Jenny, like when that idea became apparent that it was going to be, when it became apparent that that was going to be a kind of guiding principle of the book, this idea of the antonym in the process, how did you reach it? And also, like, what are some of the other sort of metaphors or tropes that for you feel like very foundational to what the book is doing? I always talk with my students about how, like, when we're putting together a collection of poems or a chapbook or something, you're looking for like the metaphors that often are going to work within the context of the poem, but they're also going to be like metaphors for your craft as a poet. And so, I mean, antonyms seem to do that in a really interesting way. So yeah, I was just wondering if you could speak to that, any of that.
Yeah, for sure. I was just walking one day, and I was sort of thinking about antonyms, and I was thinking about poetry and sort of empathy, and really the way actually that I found empathy for my mother and what she was going through was through poetry, because poetry just wrestles so much with the human condition, and you're really kind of digging at the best and the worst of it in some cases. And and I just sort of thought about how, especially when we talk about things like substance use, my family started going through this when I was still a teenager. And so, like I had always, you grow up and you hear adults say drugs are bad, like how many times do we hear that? And so then to watch a parent struggle with that as a teenager, you're sort of like, well, you feel like they must be just inherently wrong and they're making poor choices and all of these things. And so it wasn't until I got older and kind of learned to empathize a little bit more that I understood that it's not black and white. And so the antonyms were sort of a way to challenge that idea of what's black and white a little bit. And so I started thinking about things that don't have antonyms. And of course, all of the things in the book, all of the antonym poems are for things that don't have antonyms.
Right.
And it was
I didn't notice. You're right. I didn't even. God, I missed
yeah,
that.
because that wasn't interesting to me.
Yes.
So I, so that sort of, and then it just sort of became, the antonym poems were never about my mother to begin with, actually. They were more just sort of exercises. And then when I started applying them to what I was going through, like sort of through the grief process, they ended up sort of becoming the framework for the book, oddly. And I think the Antonym for Daughter poem especially was the moment where it kind of clicked for me. And Michael, you helped so much with this. You helped so much with the ordering of the book and the structure. But it was almost like once I figured out where the antonym poems had to go, the rest of the book kind of clicked into place.
Explains why the book was so neat, so clean.
Yeah, that was Michael's doing. It wasn't mine.
It was very neat before.
No.
No, I mean, I read it. I'm like, oh, it's not much for me to do here. I'll just poke at it pro forma. Yeah, no, I mean, frankly, the whole antonym idea is really striking, and it makes me think of what you've done as a kind of anti-elegy. Just to hear you sort of talk about the protective qualities of poetry, hearing you read your poems and poems that sort of skirt the reality, bring in new kinds of reality, and by other kinds of reality, I mean that sometimes I feel you write ghost stories. I mean, the question I want to ask you is, like, do you believe in ghosts? Because this is a book that's filled with them. Where in a literal sense, like, these are poems that sort of speak to them, invite them in, describe them. You feel, and then of course there's the metaphors of feeling ghosted, feeling haunted, and so there is it's almost as though I feel like it's one of those sort of stencils where you sort of like stencil in, the shape, and then you remove it, and it's just like, it's just what was inside, that you've I mean, I can't remember who quite put this, called sort of elegies, the word made flesh, but if it's the other way around, it's funny. You kind of deflesh the person in a way, and fill that space with other things, and yet at the very, despite that, we know exactly what happened. We know exactly how you feel. Honestly, I feel like you've kind of stumbled on a very different way of writing elegies. I just can't quite compare with anything else, any other elegies that I've read. So the antonym for me is quite powerful because, then the question becomes, what's the antonym for elegy? And it's, what's the opposite of writing an elegy? And still get the same power. And I think, yeah. So the other thing that strikes me is that these are not elegies in the sense of you sort of talking about absence. I don't know if that makes any sense, but like,
It does. Yeah.
yeah. So you're filling space up. You're filling the spaces up with things. So, I mean, the elegies that I've written, the elegies that I've published, the elegies that I've read are always at the end you realize something has been taken away from the world. But you know, you do the other thing. You want to fill up the poems with stuff. I don't know if that strikes with what you noticed, Michael, when you were reading through the book.
Very much so. It feels very different from like we're in, I look around at contemporary poetry and I don't see anyone quite doing it, like dealing with grief and dealing with like various complicated relationships in this way. There's so much. James Arthur once zoomed into my class and he talked about the Canadian poet living in America, James Arthur. He's got a really great book called Charms Against Lightning. And he talked about how, like, for him, the poem was kind of like a suit of armor. And, you see the living thing, the life beneath it in many ways. But the words are kind of like armor. And it made me think of what Jenny said earlier about poem as protection.
Yeah.
So no, it's very powerful.
I think we have 2 questions. So.
Yay. Awesome.
From Erica Maltby. The collection reads well. How did you decide what order to put the poems in? When can we keep hope to see your next published collection? Both good questions.
Yeah. Yeah, they're great questions. Erica is like probably my oldest childhood friend, so this is awesome. But so the book had, like, I don't know how many variations is possible when you have 50 poems in a book, but I would say it probably went through all of them. I just reordered it constantly, and then I would take poems out that didn't feel strong anymore, or poems that just didn't seem like they fit, and it was just like a constant reshuffling until it went to Michael, and then Michael finally really was the one who made sense of it. I really can't take credit for the order at all. Like I was able to move a few things around once but it's like he was like the construction worker. Like he built the house and then I went in and decorated. That's kind of how it.
I think you're giving me way too much credit, but I will say my first book, I gave a sheaf of poems to Carmine and I said, I don't know what the order is. And then Carmine ordered it entirely for me.
Yeah. Well, I do think it's hard when you're in it. It's really hard to see the different possibilities, and you really need somebody with a good eye to kind of have a fresh perspective on it.
I think it's the thing that it's very hard to learn how to order a collection without having someone who's done it before show you.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. It's also, I think, an underrated skill.
Yeah.
I have seen poems because of how we order them go from being sort of minor to being major, based on where they are in the book, and picking up resonances from everything around them. And poems can become so dramatically different if they open a book or if they close a book. It's funny what can happen when you have an eye, when you put your eye towards sort of trying to figure out what the relationships with the poems are. But the order of your book, I think, is quite important. I mean, I think there is a progression of the poems. And the poems do pick up power. I don't think we actually read poems from beginning to end. Not really. We dip in. At some point we do. At some point, you're after sort of after having a sense of the material in a book, you do sort of maybe give it a read from beginning to end. But I don't think that changes oddly, that doesn't change the power of poems and where they are in the book.
Yeah.
I haven't quite built up the theory here, but like I think the fact that one dips into a book doesn't change the importance of needing to order it, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I feel like
And
it builds a kind of index in your mind of
yeah,
affect, of emotions you have. And so when you read a new poem that you haven't read before in the book and you flip the next page and you see one you have read before, you remember your reaction,
yeah,
and it kind of over
yeah,
time
yeah,
accumulates
Yeah.
yeah. You're right.
this like
You're right.
narrative.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that was tricky with this book is there's 3 postcard poems that are all a different season. And so, as Michael had pointed out early on, like it's kind of tricky when you do that. And then you have, like, you know, if you have a postcard poem, it's in spring, and then all of a sudden you have a poem that takes place in winter, it just doesn't really make sense. So it's sort of like trying to keep track of like the literal timeline and then also just like trying to accommodate the poems. Yeah, it was tricky. It was one of the trickier parts of the whole thing, I would say.
And that's where an order will, I think, turn poems, because on the by themselves, those postcard poems don't generate as much power as they do in the book.
Yeah.
So I think that if you had just sort of given someone those poems independently, I think people's reaction to them would be one thing, just put it that way. But in the book, I mean, I think, and where they're placed, they really do have a very sort of decisive role in moving the story along. Because of course you're also telling a seasonal story. I mean, people can hear that in your poems, but this is a speaker grieving through various seasons. It's a cycle of grief, and those postcard poems really do create that. But you know, if you separate, it's a bit like sort of separating a line from a poem, and that line on itself seems kind of like banal, but in the poem suddenly it just hits you with tremendous force. I think that's what those postcard poems do. Yeah, not that they're banal, but you know what I mean. Like they're and are you working on a new collection? He says.
You know, I haven't been writing poetry lately. Okay. I've kind of shifted gears. I'm working on some nonfiction now, but it's very, very early stages still.
That's pretty smart. There's more money in nonfiction.
No kidding.
Yeah.
No kidding.
Yeah. And more agents interested in nonfiction. And okay, we have another question. Cody Klippenstein, J in, I think that's Jenny, in AFD. I never, it's funny to see the book acronym.
Me neither. It's a new thing.
Yeah, there's a Villanelle, a Sestina, and I think other poems in form too. Do you feel that formal constraints have a relationship to your subject matter? And if so, what kind?
That's a good question.
Did they help or hinder you when you wrote this book?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think specifically with the Sestina and the Villanelle, but especially the Villanelle, even though there's only one of them, I think the subject matter the form lends itself so well to grief. You know, like I can't help but think about Elizabeth Bishop's One Art, for example, which I talk about a lot when I teach about the elegy, but it's just, you know, it's like this cycle that never ends, and it's maddening. I'm a person who loves a poem that really snaps shut at the end.
Yeah.
And villanelles don't do that. You end up right kind of back where you started, in a sense, like maybe with a better understanding, but you haven't gone anywhere. You know, your feet are in the mud and you've done like a full 360. And so I think, and the Sestina is, I guess, somewhat similar in that sense. And so I think, for me, there was only so much room in the book for those. But yeah, otherwise, I mean, it's funny, I never really considered myself a formalist. Like I'm, like famously terrible at hearing meter. But somehow it's just, you write a poem and you realize you've written a bunch of couplets and you realize that they kind of rhyme and all of these things. And so I think for me, it's sort of more intuitive where it happens in the revision process. But I do like those exercises where it's just kind of like a different way to kind of try to encapsulate those cycles of grief and just explore them in a different way, I guess.
I mean, you're definitely hearing something because, I mean, the poems have a very insistent beat. There's internal rhyme.
Yeah.
I mean, they are intensely shaped. And I know that, you know, when we were sort of doing a kind of line edits, what you were accepting and rejecting had a lot to do with what your ear was telling you made sense.
Yeah.
So that's not always the case, but I did feel that you were hearing the whole poem as you were trying to understand, you know, whether to accept this change or not. Yeah. Were there, I mean, this whole question of form and elegy is an interesting one. And I guess I am curious, like Cody, if those forms at all helped you. Was there something in having a set form to work with at all? Was it all helpful when you were sort of writing through those moments?
Yeah, I think the form, you know, especially the sestina in this book, it really forced me into some like an uncomfortable space that I didn't necessarily intend to go. But when you decide to write in a form like, you know, like the sestina, for example, and you choose your words, you have to stand by those words. And every stanza, you have to make something different of it. You just kind of end up going further and further down the rabbit hole. And for me, in that poem especially, I ended up, you know, I didn't read it tonight, but I uncovered a truth that was I think it's definitely one of the darker poems in the book. And it does sort of, you know, as opposed to free verse, like I think it does force you into some interesting territory. And there's so much surprise in form if you're willing to sort of push through. I think both this Sestina and the Villanelle went through so many revisions. The Sestina especially was like years and years, but
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I mean, the Villanelle doesn't feel like it, I have to say. I mean, that's the poem we ended up publishing in the Walrus.
Yeah.
And I did get a lot of good reaction to it, but it didn't feel, to my ear, it didn't feel labored at all. It felt
That's good. That makes me feel like I did my job.
Yeah, so I think. Oh, there's another question. Medri Purdom. Thank you, Jenny and Michael, for these powerful readings. Jenny, I kept wondering if the idea of the antonym is also about the limits of language. Of course, I want to ask you what you might have learned about language by writing this book.
That's such a great question.
It is. That's a great question.
Really great question. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the things. I mean, that's definitely one of the things that compels me to write poetry in the first place. Is just, you know, it allows you to sort of push the limits of language in a way that you can't do in other forms. I think, for example. But yeah, and so it's just sort of like when we look at traditional antonyms, it's just kind of like you feel like they're not doing enough. They're not doing enough to help you understand whatever it is that you're working through. And so through poetry, you know, you can do things like make up antonyms for things that don't have antonyms. Yeah. And so it's not that you have access to more language, but it's that you're saying like, I don't care about the rules, basically. And so, yeah, it definitely, in some ways it was like about the limits of language and trying to push that a little bit. And also just trying to like understand how you kind of move past saying like, I'm in this really weird, difficult, uncomfortable in between space, which doesn't mean anything when you just say that to somebody, but yeah, the antonyms were a way for me to kind of explore that. What did I learn about language? I guess I learned that there are certain, I don't know if it's necessarily about language, but images. Like, it's so interesting to see what images you come back to again and again. And so when I go back through the book, you know, it's like you said, like ghosts, there's things like ghosts show up all the time. It's always about light and water.
Extreme weather.
Pardon?
A lot of extreme weather in your poem.
Yeah, and apparently a lot of extreme weather.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, in that way, it's like, I guess the limits are pretty apparent. And yet, you're always kind of trying to look at them in a different way.
It is funny. Like there's so many tropes of ghost story tropes in your book, in your poems.
Yeah.
Things that rattle, sort of, sort of things that creak. But yet you don't experience you don't experience the poems as ghost stories. But there is, I mean, I don't know if you were aware of it when you were writing it, but there is a certain amount of like haunting that happens in the poems.
Yeah. That was 100% intentional. And I think you would have to know more of our story to know why that would be. But I grew up in a super old house. I was always terrified of it. Wow. My mom started telling me, she was a nurse, and she always had all these ghost stories that she started telling me when I was just like a kid. And then, like we would watch horror movies together and these kind of things. And she also had this really like wicked sense of humor. And even when she was in the worst of her like mental illness and substance use, she always used to joke that she would haunt me when she died. And for those reasons, I was actually terrified when she passed away, because she had like a sort of different kind of power over me. And I think like when I think about ghosts or hauntings, I don't necessarily think of them in a literal sense, but I think of them in some way as like what's left of trauma. Yeah. And so for me, it's not about answering whether or not I believe in ghosts, because when I look at them, when I think about what a ghost could be from a trauma lens and that kind of residue, the answer is absolutely yes. Like, does it mean that I've ever seen, something come down the hall? No, but.
Oh, wow, yeah. Jenny, that is a revelation. That makes so much sense. Incredible. And we have one more question. Naris Yvonne, if you could go back and talk to the version of yourself that first started writing the collection, what would you say? Is there anything you realized in the process that you would want to impart?
That's
a time travel question.
Hmm?
A time travel question.
Yeah, I think if I could go back, I would just tell myself that it's okay to write those poems. Like I'm thinking of myself as like a 20-year-old. And also just that like it's okay to let them take time. Like this book really all in all took me like 8 or 9 years from start to finish. And that's really the time that it needed, just because of how my life was unfolding. And the book made those transitions in real time. And so, yeah, I think that's what I would, it's not a very artistic answer, but just like from a more logistical, like emotional standpoint. Yeah. I guess that's my answer.
I think I would tell my younger self to go into law. Thank you, everyone, for the great questions. Thanks, Michael, and thank you, Jenny, for the great conversation, and Jenny for the great poems, Michael for the great poems. We didn't explore the connections between your poems, Michael and Jenny, but both of you write about grief in a way, and both of you write ghost stories in a way. It's funny, but they're just to hear you talk, Jenny, I just realized that there's a great deal about what you say that I now sort of recognize in Michael's poems, particularly his new poems. And thanks to everyone who tuned in and who watched this. We have a winner. Do we have a winner for the book? And the winner of the book is Erica.
Yay.
Erica, please email marketing@vehiculepress.com to claim your prize. Thanks again, and hope to see you at the next launch. We have, actually, I'd forgotten when the next launch is. Jen, do you want to tell me when the next launch is? So our tech person is gonna October 14th, fiction. Our two books of fiction. Yeah, Alexis Morin and Cora Sio. Yes, Alexis Morin. So see you October 14th. Check our Facebook page for more information about, or our Twitter account for more information about that launch. Thanks again for watching, and I wish you all a good night.